Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our meetup. Welcome to our talk with Xinni, an actionable guide to UX and engineering collaboration. And if you stay till the end, we have a surprise Figma link for you, Figma resource for you. And if you guys haven't heard of Design Buddies before, I started Design Buddies. I'm Grace. I started Design Buddies back in April as a way to connect designers as a way to connect designers with each other. And we have a lot of free events like this, resources, mentorship. Xinni is actually one of our mentors, and our mentorship program is in partnership with Amazing Design People List. And all free events, a great community on Discord, so make sure to join in our Discord server. And we're super excited to invite Xinni on today. Xinni is a senior UX designer leading UX at YouTube Gaming. Previously, she designed social features across YouTube and Google Translate. She also graduated from National University of Singapore with a bachelor's in computing. Born in Singapore, her journey to design and code started 10 years ago from her obsession with Neopets and Deviantart. She's also passionate about improving her partnerships with engineering, product managers, and researchers, and sharing this knowledge with everyone. In her free time, she likes creating art for anime conventions. And fun fact, I actually met Xinni because we all tabled at anime conventions creating art. So welcome, Xinni. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for introducing. Yeah, I actually met Grace at Crunchyroll Expo, and I really miss anime conventions, but I'm glad I have some community here with you all, designers, and thank you so much for coming to my talk. And yeah, I'm going to start now. This talk is about how we collaborate with engineers, and I'm going to kind of share a story when I started as a designer at YouTube. So every time, back when I was a junior designer, I would finish up with my feature. And then there were like pretty cool tools that was very convenient in exporting, like automatically exporting red lines. I think there's like Sketch Measure as one of those examples. So I would just like export it to red lines and then like send it to the engineer via email because I was so proud. And once the engineers started coding, they had a lot of questions for me. They would ping me or they would set up meetings with me and they'll ask like, oh, do you remember the tablet designs? Or like, oh, what's going to happen to this? What's the loading state when the user is going through a slow connection? Or, there were some things that I designed that wouldn't work for certain languages, or I didn't take into account right to left languages. And these were the kind of things that my engineers noticed that I didn't. Because when you program, you have to program things comprehensively, and they're really, really good at spotting these things. And sometimes, there were some miscommunications with my engineers, and then they would launch something and I wouldn't know, and it would look very different from my designs. So, I was not happy. And so I look into all of this, ever since then, I've learned a lot. And the engineer org is actually one of my favorite, is my favorite organization to work with, because I came from an engineering background. I was very inspired by this background to start this side project because I just really wanted to fully understand more and learn a lot of things. I want to share it with all of you. So what I did was survey and interview 277 engineers across Google and Alphabet. And I asked them about pain points. I asked them, what do you need from designers when you build our designs? And then because I'm a pretty like lazy designer and I want to like achieve all of their needs, in the most efficient way possible, I made some templates and I'm going to share this all with you today at the end to make all of this easier. So the way I approach this problem, the Google mantra is to focus on the user. So the user today is our engineering partner. You're not going to see stuff like, how to prep your designs for PM or yourself, even though, we as designers are the users of our process as well. And I try to make it as like efficient as possible. But really, we are trying to make things comprehensive for our engineer to give them an easier time. Because, if engineers build our designs fast, they build it perfectly, this will lead to fewer bugs. There will be fewer launches that are blocked, and you can sort of start seeing faster sprints and cycles. So if you're thinking about if you're evangelizing any of this to your organization, these are some ways you can measure success. So what I'll start with first are user needs. What are the user needs and pain points? And then I'll go really, really nitty-gritty into what kind of design details they expect when you hand off your designs to them. And then the third part is about tools, which is very tactical, practical, like what kind of tools do designers use today and what kind of tools do engineers prefer? And then we'll go into the collaboration process, because we all know that, working with engineers is not just about handoff, it's not just about picking the right tool, it's about following the right communications and process as well. And lastly, I want to share all the templates that I made to help with this. So yeah, let's start with the first part. I'm going to take about half an hour for walking through all of this. And after that, we'll go with a Q&A. So post your questions on the chat, and our friendly moderators here will represent, and I will try to answer some at the end of the talk. So the first question I asked my engineers, 274 people responded to this, is how satisfied are you when working with designers? And as you can see here from the number 3.4.5, there is, it's okay. So far, it's okay. And there's definitely room for improvement. I kind of asked this question so that if I do future studies like this later on, I can see whether it improve or deprove. So this is kind of like a baseline measurement. But right now, everything is okay. And then this is going to be a little heavy, but I asked about 10 different issues when building UI. And I think you might relate to some of this. And I'm going to go through these 10 because we are going to keep going back to this throughout this talk. So the first one is an issue where the engineer sees that a designer has specified, a component that is like completely new to the design system. Like for, in most cases, like with not good enough rationale, or something that just a whole new color, or something that doesn't fit in well with the system. And then the next issue is a design that's infeasible. And the third issue is a design that's not accessible. So you can see like this button right here is really hard to see. The fourth issue engineers encounter is missing behavior explanation. So maybe the designer just sends a mock to the engineer without explaining what it does. And the fifth issue is missing error states or missing offline states. The sixth issue is all about, the next few issues are all about missing things. So it's like missing values, missing details, or missing edge cases. The last three issues are about, when the designer hands off the spec, the values are pretty redundant. There's stuff like, opacity, color, that's already maybe specified by the core library. And the last two issues about when a designer, specs a component for the engineer, they sort of use raw values, and raw values is what I call like the FFF instead of like the white, or like what the system calls it. And because, like how it works in code is we define styles in it. And if the designer kind of specifies like, this is 14 pixels Google sends, the engineer will have to manually translate these raw styles into the actual styles. And the last issue we talked about is getting imprecise values from the designer. So like, stuff like 17.6 pixels spacing. And actually, fun fact, this really, really annoys me whenever I see designer spec. There's like clearly not on the grid or like with a decimal point. This really annoyed me. And this was like the reason I started this. But later on, you'll see how much this really matters. So this is the one slide, like if you take, I know this talk is full of information, but if there's only one thing that you take home today, it will be this slide. So we basically asked the engineers to rank all of those issues that I shared with you. And what I did was rank it from the most frequent problem to the least frequent. And then with the colors red and orange, red, we had a follow-up question asking them, which of these are actually severe, which really, really impact you. So the ones that are in red, a lot of people just mention it. So as you can see here, the top three pain points are missing edge cases, missing error states, offline states, loading states. And the third one is deviating from styles and components. And you can see here, they're all also really red. So it was really interesting to me that the most common issues were also very, very severe to them, because you can have something like totally not common, like maybe infeasible design, but that can still be severe. So this was just very interesting to me. And then there is missing values, where sometimes there's missing, width or colors, and then lacking in behavior explanation. They were the fourth and fifth most frequent and slightly severe pain point. And the next category of, you can see like there's fewer and fewer of these now, but engineers also mention, using raw values, not accounting for accessibility or having imprecise values. These were less frequent, but still the engineers still experience it. So as you can see here, actually using very incorrect or imprecise values is not that severe. It's not as severe as forgetting an edge case. It's not as severe as, making your design inaccessible. So the whole reason I started this side project was because I was really annoyed that designers weren't being precise in their spec, and I thought that was important. But actually, you see how low it is in the list. It just kind of taught me like how to prioritize my spec better. Like I should totally be prioritizing edge cases rather than trying to make sure that my designs are pixel perfect when I send it to engineers. And the last two least common issues, but also engineers encounter, is a design being technically infeasible or just having too much information in the spec. So this also kind of taught me that it's okay to over communicate in the spec. Like even though very few engineers think that spec have too much information, and even if they do, it's not really severe to them. So please use this chart when you're prioritizing things. When you're prioritizing your design handoff, it's most important to have edge cases, it's most important to have error cases. So this is still going to be pretty heavy, but I'm going to go through these issues one by one because we asked the engineers follow-up questions for each of these issues. And we kind of figure out top themes and findings from each of them. So the first one is edge cases. And I think if you recall, I separated edge cases and offline state. And this is why, because engineers, they kind of see edge cases in two different ways. So edge cases, there's one that's situational, so for example, if you're designing like video recommendations on YouTube and you need the user to be signed in. So when the user is signed out, that is a kind of situational edge case that you think about. But then there's this other category called the always there edge cases. And it's stuff like having a loading state. It's stuff like having an offline state. Like everything most people design like needs an internet connection, and internet connections die. So this is something that every designer has to account for in their handoff. But unfortunately, engineers don't see it. And engineers tend to be more forgiving for the situational one. But for the ones that like are always there, stuff that is like offline loading, they are kind of less forgiving about that because they really expect you to think about it. And another thing that came out was internationalization. So, for right to left languages or like a string being very, very long, this is something they brought up very frequently. That was, they always had to handle it themselves, or they find out very late, close to a launch. So as you can see some quotes here, the engineers kind of noticed that designers will always give the core journeys, the main flow, but they have never seen a design spec that accounts for network errors or high latency. They comment that they always see the perfect case in the mocks. And this causes them, trouble because they have to do the design work themselves. Or if the edge case is very severe, they will have to go back to the designer and, waste more time to ask for a clarification. The next issue is deviating from default styles and components. And this one, some designers tell me that, hey, like, of course we need to make new components. We are designers and we design the best components for the user. I totally agree with that. I think this pain point is about how there's no good rationale when a designer proposes a new component or maybe doesn't explain it to the engineer. But I wanted to share like why engineers prefer existing components. And I think this is something that designers also prefer as well, having one unified design system. But the engineering side of it is that, existing components are already very robust. It has all the functionality. They already like take care of all the edge cases and all the accessibility that's built into those components. So whenever a designer proposes a new component or like a one-off component that doesn't really scale to the rest of the system, this is very expensive for the engineer. And because timelines and launch pressures and all of that stuff, they don't have time to make the new component robust. So yeah, this causes them time. And when they receive a one-off component, they kind of have to look through the code, negotiate with the designer, like, oh, can you use this existing thing instead? So and this is completely normal, like there's always going to be this negotiation. Engineers are always going to try to be cheap, but this is like, it's really great to have this healthy conversation and understand where they're coming from and why they prefer using existing components. The issue number 3 that we talked about was, a designer may be handing off a mock and not explaining like how everything behaves. So we found out 2 themes from the engineers that replied to the survey. So engineers tend to find, design handoff and spec very static. They just see maybe a bunch of mocks. So it doesn't talk about motion. It doesn't talk about what happens, when you interact with this tooltip, when you interact with this button. The second kind of spec they tend to see is spec that is too focused on the details. So a designer can be very good at saying like, oh, there's a margin of 4 pixels here, and this color is pink. But it's lacking the big picture. Like, why are we, introducing this component? And this is really important because we found out that engineers themselves, they have to write their own design documents. They have to plan the infrastructure of something if they want, everything they build to scale. So especially when they're starting to plan their system, their infrastructure, that is the best time to talk about how your components will scale, why it's being used, so that they can also design their code to be as scalable as possible. And as you can see here in the code, the engineer said that tooltips are a great example because engineers usually have to ask, does it dismiss on touch? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so attacked because I totally like put tooltips in mocks, and I don't really say like what happens when it, when the user clicks outside of the screen, or like how long does it stay there. I kind of just like expect engineers to figure it out. So these are just, things that we kind of take for granted. Tooltips, so easy, it's just a speech bubble. But there's actually very a lot of complex interactions that we are responsible to communicate. And these are, I'm just going to go through like pretty quickly the rest of the issues we found out. So missing values, I think, is pretty obvious why that waste the engineer time, because they have to like come back to the designer to ask. And this is when they say it really helps to use for the designer to use a tool where they can just inspect themselves, like using their like Figma or using Sketch to do it themselves. And then about using raw values. So basically this one is about not using, the code components and the style names in the code. This one just takes more time to the engineers as well, because they have to do this translation game. And sometimes if they, for more junior engineers, they will just re-implement something, and that will just lead to like worse code health. As for accessibility, oh my gosh, this was very interesting to me, because I found out that engineers brought up accessibility because it was blocking their launches. And for more context, in big companies like Google, we have these launch guardrails, and we have people, QAing accessibility. So in the case where something is not accessible, there will be people who are reviewing who actually block the launch. So because the designer didn't notice it, the engineer didn't notice it, it blocks the launch. And this is like, I would say like the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is if you have an organization that doesn't have these guardrails, and things just go out to the user that are not accessible. Yeah, so I think this is just a reminder that this is something that we are responsible for. And lastly, invisible designs. You can see that it wasn't very common, for a designer to share invisible designs. But whenever this happens, this is the most frustrating pain point for engineers. And everyone we talked to about this said that like early communication will just solve this.
being involved in the design process as early as possible. There are a few times when this is caused by platform differences, and also I'm like very guilty of this because like I would design for Android and then assume that this will just like scale to iOS. But like recently, for example, I found out that like line height isn't supported on iOS. Like I'm not sure this is for iOS in general, but I found out like for the app that I worked on, YouTube, this just wasn't there. So this like having knowledge of these platform differences from your engineer will be very helpful as well. So I really touched on all the recommendations, but I just want to give a recap on what I recommend for all of these pain points. So as we know, having missing age on the extreme cases and error states, this is the top most problem for engineers. So we can't just show the perfect case anymore. We have the responsibility to account for edge cases. And then deviating from default styles and components, I think that again, this is more of communication. Whenever you notice that there's a new component you're introducing, for example, what I do now in Spec is I will say like, oh, this is a new component I'm introducing. This is its name. And don't worry, it's not a one-off. This is how it will scale. This is why we need it. In user research, this was the best pattern. This is about explaining to them, that you are designing for scale and you've already considered all the existing components. And if you can identify existing stuff that still works for your design, then this is just better for the code base, saves time. So this is a negotiation with your engineer, healthy discussion. As for lacking behavior explanation, like my top recommendation is whenever the engineer is starting their design doc, that is the best time to talk about behaviors. It's the best time to talk about scalability. And as for using raw values, just try to use the same, speak the same language as engineers. If they, name the colors a certain way in the code, ideally this is, synonymous with your design system and how, you name it there, but try to not re-specify, new values over and over again. Accessibility, I have not much to say here, but this is a responsibility from us. If we are not going to catch it, engineers not going to catch it. If your organization doesn't have guardrails, your users are just going to see non-accessible things. As for incorrect, imprecise values, remember this was why I started this project, and I was really annoyed by it. But to be honest, like knowing how little it matters, to have a pixel perfect spec, kind of gives me relief a bit because I can focus on more important things like edge cases. So what I actually do today is I will teach my engineers, what a key line is, what a grid is. If you see some random ass number like 17 pixels, please round it to 16. Or if you see like 8.9, please put it back to 8. Yeah, so you just, engineers are fine. They can self-correct. Just teach them, to round things to 4. It's not that hard. Technically infeasible is again discussing early with engineers. So yeah, overall, there are very, very, 3 very distinct themes we found in all of these pain points. So for example, engineers care about having a healthy code base. They don't want one-off components. So these are the pain points that kind of map to the user needs that affect that need. They obviously want to work fast. They don't really want to, have to ping you out of nowhere if they can help it. They want to be uninterrupted in their workflow. And lastly, they don't want to get blocked in launches. And really, the only thing that's blocking them is accessibility for organizations that have guardrails. So yeah, thank you for bearing with me through this very heavy first section. I think that was like the most important section that I wanted to take away, wanted you all to take away. And now, because I was still kind of broad, I'm really going to go nitty-gritty into the design details, what tends to be forgotten. So I listed about 7 categories of design details, like edge cases, visuals, the flow, accessibility, how things transition. And this is like not very useful, but it was more like a gut check. Like engineers said that all of them were pretty important to show in your design spec. What's interesting is, again, they said that frequently missing is edge cases. And Interestingly enough, sizing behavior, which I would say is kind of like an edge case, because you design for the perfect case, which is mobile, and then you might forget edge cases like small screens. We designers tend to be very good at specifying the visual details and the interaction, the flows, which is like our main job. And also engineers mentioned a lot, accessibility, transition, internationalization. So what exactly are these categories and what are the details inside? Like, what should we be communicating? So I made this cheat sheet. I essentially went through 143 engineering responses and I listed all the things that they expected in Spec. So don't worry, we'll be making this, resource available at the end of this presentation. So you don't have to digest all of it right now, but I'll just call out, interesting ones that I would have never thought about. So for example, edge cases, an engineer mentioned low power mode. I just would have never thought about that, and as for size and responsiveness, maybe, typefaces that, are dynamic, like you can set different typefaces, or like platform specific things like an iPhone, the notch. I just, people tend to forget that, and including me as well. I also want to call out accessibility, because as I was working through, all my resources, I had to admit that I still don't know the best way to spec for accessibility. However, I did find, the top 3 things that engineers care about, and they are specifying a touch target, labeling your components, so that a screen reader can read it out, and focus flow. So when you're doing keyboard navigation, you specify like how the keyboard sort of like traverses the UI with instead of using a mouse. This is just really simplifying it. Accessibility is such an important and also complex like thing to spec for. But yeah, this is everything we heard from engineers that designers tend to forget, that I have incorporated in the future templates. So the third part is about tools that designers use for and to work with engineers. And I did this survey last year, and last year the favorite tool that engineers use for Handoff is Gallery. And for context, Gallery is an internal Google tool, which I think it's also external, but it's definitely a Google tool by Material Design. And how you use it is like people used to use Sketch, and then there will be this plugin, and the plugin will export it to Gallery. And then on Gallery, there's this like inspect mode, which you can trigger, and the engineers can sort of see like the spacing between components and the colors and all of that stuff. So this was the number 1 tool that was used. For people who are not in Google, I think very similar tools are InVision, Zeppelin. A lot of tools provide this functionality. What surprised me was Sketch was one of the favorite tools last year. Because this meant that an engineer had to pay $99 and then own a Mac and then download Sketch just to like inspect, the designer's designs. But this was also one of the top favorites. Some engineers use slides. As you can see here, Figma only has 12 favorites, but this is right before Figma got really popular. If I were to hypothesize, I think Figma would be number 1 today. In case you're interested, there are more things that people use, like a HTML prototype, or just some engineers are like, just give me an image, I don't care. They use as well. So it's not really important what specific tools, but more of like the functionality that engineers want in a design handoff tool. So consistently, we saw that the top 3 features that the engineers want to use is being able to inspect values and being able to comment on the design spec so that they can, go back and forth with the designer. They also like it if it's easy to use and access. So the great thing about Gallery, which is the Google internal tool, was that you just had a URL, you click into it, everyone could access it. Figma, I think, is a bit more difficult because you have to get a viewer account, but oh boy, Sketch was the worst because if your engineer uses like a Linux or something like GG. He's never going to be able to access your spec. So they just really like it when your slides is just another example of something that's easy to access. And then if you're interested, these are all the other things that the engineers appreciate. Having they like, some really like it when there's realistic behavior. Some really like it when they are able to see the design being explained, having motion, getting assets easily. So yeah, so this engineer commented that they like, the comment functionality to be very specific to the part of the design. So I think Figma does have that functionality. And then another one says that this was really interesting to me. So I was like, oh my God, why do so many engineers use Sketch? Like this is the designer tool. But what was interesting to me was this engineer wanted to just look at the designs himself. He did not want designers to translate to him, what a designer, what a design meant. They wanted to like draw these relationships out themselves. So I think this is the last part for our insights. This is about the broader collaboration process. So here are the things that we wanted to learn. I have here kind of like your typical designer engineer process. When you start designing, you would negotiate the cost of something. You explain why you made your design decisions. And when the engineer starts coding, maybe you have a meeting to kick off the implementation. And then when you're ready to launch something, maybe you do like a bug bash. These are just some activities that you do when you're working with engineers. So we wanted to find out, especially when you're studying implementation, what are the process pain points? And when the engineer is building a feature, how often do they guess information? Like I was seriously curious to know how often will they try to deal with something themselves? How would they like to communicate? And all these activities I listed out, how important are they actually? So one of the few things we learned in terms of process pain points was the number one pain point is a design changing halfway. And I actually think this is really hard to avoid. I think that we have research previously in Google that shows that designs change halfway because of last minute stakeholders feedback. It's just the pains of being in a large organization. So I think this is all. I personally think it's okay for a design to change halfway. I think this is more like communicating it. More process pain points if they don't know if a spec is final or not, and they don't know whether it is ready, or just 58% of people who responded did not even have a spec. So I think that's something we can easily fix by giving them a spec. But other than that, it's all about communication and being clear on status. So I also found that 80% of engineers guess missing information. So if you remember all the missing edge cases, all the missing values, know that 80% of the time your engineer is struggling on their own, trying to guess it by themselves. And this is just not good. How can we improve this? And first, by looking into how to improve it, we want to know why they will guess information themselves. So the number one reason is speed, or they think the issue is small. Any incorrect guesses can be fixed later. This one was really interesting because this kind of made me realize that I should definitely share my feedback after implementation as well, because a lot of engineers are just leaving something for a final review. Or sometimes they think that the designer is hard to reach, not very free. So this is something, again, how you make yourself available to your engineer, being there for them. Yeah. And then there's reasons I don't know how to reach out, or I'm uncomfortable. We also asked how they prefer to talk with designers. The number one way is, again, I think it's because of the speed factor, but they really prefer chat. This is just in Google, we use Hangouts, Meet, chat. But in your organization, maybe it's Slack, or maybe it's whatever instant messaging feature that you all use. They like being in person. And this is something that's really tough right now because of COVID and everything is remote. but know that in-person collaborations is just a very, very essential part to the design and developer process. They also like commenting on the design spec, commenting via email. Buganizer, again, is this internal task tracking tool. So maybe for you all, it could be Jira, it could be Asana, but they like using bug tracking tools as well. Commenting on the PRD, commenting on their Eng doc is a bit less commonly preferred, but I guess a few engineers like it when you do that. So yeah, there's I think the takeaway is like there's no one size fits all. Just work out a communication plan with your engineer and talk about what best tools work for you. And as for all these activities that I mentioned previously, I guess this is just another a gut check, but all of the activities I've mentioned, like sharing your design rationale or like doing a bug bash, these were all rated as important by engineers. So discussing cost and feasibility, this is about doing this early. We have more internal research that shows that engineers are more aware of these edge cases than we are. And again, I just want to be I just want to say that it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not specify all the edge cases up front. Like, remember, this is like a partnership with you and your engineer. And a lot of the time, your engineer knows the ins and outs of the system more. So as long as you make an effort, you don't have to know everything. This is something you do together. Sharing progress updates is especially important when an engineer is coding before a design has been finalized. Because again, the top pain point where a design is like changing halfway into implementation, this can be elevated if you all are talking frequently. And now I'm on my final insight. Thank you so much for bearing with me through all of these information. This is the final insight, and also like my favorite slide. Like, we asked about what do your successful collaboration with designers look like? And I had some really funny answer like, oh, I'm married to a designer for 10 years or something like that. But I wanted to share that the number one trait of designer-developer collaboration is just a lot of communication, the designer being available for the developer. So them having a lot of in-person discussions, or like whenever they have questions, the designer will tell them. So this was really surprising to me because like in all the previous slides, I was like, oh, edge cases are important, have a very good spec. But really what was most important to the engineer is you being there for them. They care about having fast cycles, so they like it when a designer is able to iterate very quickly on designs based on their feedback. And I think some of them really love working with designers in real time. And then I had this like weird miscellaneous category where like a designer doing things. So doing things like filing bugs or like giving good spec, doing a kickoff, sharing principles. Like, these are the things that engineers appreciate. In the last one, engineers talked about the character of the designer. So being, very knowledgeable and adaptable to tech limitations, being open to change, taking in their feedback, being inspiring. Yeah, so these were just traits of very successful partnerships between designers and developers. So yeah, with about 5 minutes left into the presentation, before we go into Q&A, I wanted to share with you templates that I made. Actually I made them for myself because I'm like pretty lazy as a designer. I don't really have time to be super comprehensive. So I made these templates to kind of be fast yet comprehensive in design handoff. So this is something you can review after the presentation, but everything that I covered in the earlier parts, I condensed into this process chart. So if you're thinking about how to improve your process, these are just like things you should do, but things you can do throughout the process with your engineer, and things that to keep in mind. And then I really focus on the part where the engineers start coding, because that is when the most information transfer happens here. And for that, I have two options for you all. The first one is a spec template on Figma, and the second one is a checklist for Handoff. So for the Figma spec template, and don't worry, we'll be sharing the links with you all later. But this is essentially a template that I made to make sure that we specify everything that engineers expect in a spec. So let me see whether I can open it and share it with you all. Oh wait, the link is not working. Hold on. I'm gonna type it out. Oh, well, I just found out that my link wasn't working. Okay, well, I'll just use the slides and the screenshot that I made. But what I did was I would have like a top row for the perfect flow. And then because like I'm still very lazy. You know, when I design, I still want to design for the perfect like golden main user journey. So what I did was I added another row just for edge cases. And this is all like using auto layout. So whenever you add a mock, you know, it will all like very neatly like align itself into place. But I will have stuff like, here are the general errors, here are network errors, to kind of remind you that there's a space for you to think about them and include it in your spec. I will also have a new row for different sizes. So things that I forget a lot is like landscape mode and like tablet. So I kind of have columns for all of these for you to populate those versions into your mock. So this template kind of biases to designers like me who have to design for iOS, Android, mWeb, tablet, web. And like I think a lot of us are like really lazy and we always do like mobile first and then get all of the approvals and then like do like desktop and tablet and TV and stuff like that afterwards. So I kind of optimized this template for that. Like, okay, when you start designing, go ahead and settle your main flows first, but know that to like, you know, there is still work to be done after you are done with your main flow. There's, you know, error states and there's landscape mode. And still, that's a bit of effort, right? So what I did was something that was faster. So if you're really out of time and you have no time to spec at all, what I have here is, you know, a handoff checklist. So how you can do this is, for example, you have mocks. So you just present this on the screen with your developer, and then you just go through this checklist. So for example, you tell them like what components already exist and what components are new. And you tell them, you know, we go through like all the design details such as accessibility, internationalization. You just walk through them with your developer. So this requires no prep at all. It's just something that you do in a kickoff with your developer. So everything I talked about, all the pain points, all of like, you know, component status, all of that are like essentially summarized in either of these two templates, depending on how much time you have. So I talked about a lot about recommendations for designers. I just want to wrap up this deck with, you know, recommendations for people who make design systems, because I really think ultimately, you know, even when designers individually, you know, adhere to their responsibilities, there's a lot of things that can be made more efficient on the leadership level and on the system level. So if you are someone who works on design systems, you now know that designers always have to like account for error states and loading states and sign out states. So when you make a design system, you know, sure, like colors and fonts and typography, they're really important. But think about how you can also unify, you know, these edge cases that have to be accounted by all the designers that you serve. And then ideally, you know, your components that you design is hand in hand with the engineer who codes the system as well. And I have a lot of opinions about design organizations and design leadership, because I also feel like, for example, one thing that I feel very strongly about is perf and career incentivization. It's like, how do you promote designers? So a lot of organizations promote designers based on their leadership, leadership, stakeholder management, being able to be visible, being able to articulate their design rationale to other designers. But think about how your career ladder also accounts for their partnership with engineers, because ultimately our engineers are like the stewards of our final product. And if, you know, if designers are incentivized to get promoted based on like promoted based on giving great design presentations, then that is forgetting a very important part of the process. And yeah, thank you so much again for attending my talk. I wanted to especially thank Grace, Marisa, Jess. Thank you all for helping me moderate this study and organizing it in this really cute design buddies background here. I wanted to thank Clara from Material Design. She's the researcher who mentored me throughout this study. And obviously all the engineers who gave me this data, who trusted me with this data and to represent them. And some designers who supported me and helped with the templates as well. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be taking some questions now. Feel free to drop them in the chat and stay until the end. We will be taking a group photo and a group wave or any movement you want for our Instagram story. So hit us up with some questions. I saw some in the chat as well, so I will be scrolling up, see some questions. There is one I found about UX research, which is interesting. Let me just scroll to find it. And meanwhile, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll be reading them out loud. And we have almost 300 of you in here, which is amazing. All these buddies everywhere. Cool. So Li Ting asks, this is great sharing and insight, Xinni. I understand that big companies like Google have their UX researchers. May I know how do you communicate with them in order to convince engineers that a new component is scalable, relevant, and etc.?
Okay, so this is for UX researchers. That's a good question. So my process is whenever I make a design, I will always try to use the components that engineers prefer, like the ones that exist in the system. Because at YouTube, we kind of have to make everything, even though we have like over 100 designers, we have to make everything look like it's all by one designer, right? So it's just really important to the design organization as well that you use existing stuff. So usually my engineers don't have a problem with it. So I'll take this to usability testing with my researcher, assuming that all the foundational research is done and we are all aligned on the user needs. We'll take the design through usability testing. And if in the usability test, I tried using this existing component and it didn't work out, then that is just evidence that it's not like using something existing is not working out and we'll probably need something custom. So I will invite our engineers to the usability test report as well. Like we are all in the same room together, being aligned on that. And yeah, usually I don't have a problem with engineers don't really push back because we all care about our users. And also whenever I make a new component, I make it as scalable as possible. I say like, I know you're building this for this one feature right now, but think about our roadmap. We have these 4 other features, and I made sure that this new component you're building will scale to these 4 other features. So you're not just building something one-off for this feature, you're doing this for our entire roadmap. It's very important stuff. So that's usually how I do it.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to read off a few more questions. So Tan Hui Min Grace asked, hey Xinni, is there any particular aspect of UX that you find the most fulfilling? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Any aspect of UX that I find the most fulfilling? I think my most fulfilling part is the first thing that comes to my mind, I guess, is launching something and then seeing like maybe someone on Reddit like commenting on it, like just making it out there to the users, like knowing that you made someone's life better. That's fulfilling. But I think fun, I always have a lot of fun with my engineers, and that's why I started this project, because I just wanted to. I had a lot of like personal ways that I wanted to share with the world, like how I collaborate, but I also wanted this to be data backed. So this is why I started this project. Like I really love working with engineers.
That's awesome. There was a few questions actually about sizing. So Sheen and Keith asked, for design, do you usually indicate dimensions in terms of pixels or use like M's, percentages? when the engineers do responsive design, or do the engineers convert it to pixels themselves? And like, how would you think about like sizing and stuff?
Yeah, for sizing, so I'm a feature designer and I build upon like a grid system that already exists. So it depends on the platform, I think. Um, but for example, for Android, maybe how I do it is like this component is full width and there's like 32 pixels padding like on the sides. So yeah, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, this is not a very technical answer, but like somehow they manage and it works.
That's
Like
great.
full width paddings, that's it.
Nice. Well, Samuel asked, how do you follow up with your engineers? Do you set up weekly meetings? Do you ask them to show you a demo? How do you ensure that they implement your design the way that's intended?
Yeah, maybe this is just how I work, but my team has 30 engineers. I cannot possibly like follow up with every single one of them. So what I do is I work most closely with my TLs, which is the engineering team lead. So for like strategy stuff or like introducing new components, like I work with their boss. Like their boss says, okay, I'm going to assume that everyone else says, okay. So yes, we definitely have like a 1 hour, like weekly with my engineering leads to just really agree on the product direction and any new components that needs to be surfaced. And this is usually like the first pass because they are really good at telling me edge cases as well. So that's one of the weekly meetings. Another one I have is for all the other engineers, the ICs. This is when I kind of just show them. I'll also show them like the design iterations. This is mainly to inspire them, but sometimes they do give me feedback. So yeah, short answer is yes, I have weeklies, one with my TL, my team lead, and one with the wider team.
Cool. We have time for a few more questions. I'll try to get to as much as I can. So Praveen asks, while managing a design system, have you ever missed a use case which had major impacts on other areas as well? And how do you handle such situation? And is it pushed to a later release?
Yeah, managing a design system. I'm not really a design systems engineer. A design systems designer. So let me think about it. I'll think about it in terms of a design I worked on. Have I ever missed on a use case?
That's fine if you don't want, if you want to skip. That's totally okay as well.
I think the short answer is yes, it's pushed to a later release. If it really impacts a lot of users, it gets prioritized and slated for the next release. And also maybe this is a chance for me to share like something I fucked up earlier on in my career where I designed something was like channel recommendations on the YouTube page. And basically it like pushed the subscribe button down. And then when I tested in user research, it was fine. And because like my prototype was super smooth, like the recommendations came immediately. So what happened like in real life when it was implemented was like there was a delay when the recommendations appeared. So like they were going to click subscribe and then the subscribe button just like moved. And then I remember there were like Reddit comments about like how this is terrible design. So yes, I definitely designed stuff that like missed out on something very important because again, I didn't account for like real technical limitations, like things taking a long time to load, for example, that we will like try to roll out a fix in the next release.
Oh, wow. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. And Kathy asks, Xinni, how do you find time to conduct this research on top of your full-time job as the UX lead of YouTube gaming?
Just have no life and no friends. No, I'm just kidding. I think I really want to thank Google for being very supportive of people having side projects. And also like I took like a year to do this because I was always like distracted with other things. But yeah, somehow it took me a really long time. Yeah.
Cool. And I guess we can take a few more questions. So Jacqueline and Pierce asks, usually where would the responsibility fall when it comes to accounting for enlisting or discovering edge cases, like PMs, designers, engineers, and like what kind of role do they each play in this?
Oh yeah, this is really interesting because like sometimes when the engineers talked about the edge cases, they're like, oh, maybe this is a PM thing. How do I I think I don't have like a clear answer for this. I have worked with PMs who have very comprehensive PRDs who are really good at listing those edge cases. But I think a lot of the time, it's like my weekly meetings with my PM and Eng lead, and we'll do it together. I think the way that works best for me is together. But I've seen teams succeed where like I see the PM's PRD and it's like 10 different edge cases or like a spreadsheet. I'll poke my PM. I'm like, why don't I have that? Why don't I have that? It really depends on team. I would love a PM who like listed out the edge cases too. But right now it's a collaboration between me, my engineer, and my PM.
Cool. We'll take one more question and then we'll take a group photo after this. Well, there's some really great questions here. Sorry, I can't get to all of them, but feel free to connect with Xinni and join Design Buddies to further ask your questions. I feel like the UX engineering is such a job that's upcoming right now. And Doe asked, does your team have any UX engineers as well? If yes, how do you work with them?
Oh yeah, this is really interesting because this project got really popular internally because UX engineers shared it. They just felt like this because they spend their lives being a bridge between UX and engineers, so they really related to a lot of this. But yeah, no, I do not work with any UX engineers. But I think that's because the stuff I work on isn't like super complex in terms of interactions. It's like, oh yeah, you click this rectangle and then like a bigger rectangle appears. But I know that there are teams in YouTube that deal with more complex interactions, like especially the one in the watch player. They definitely work with UX engineers, and the most successful UX engineers I've seen like really impact the code base. So like even though they made something for a prototype, it was later on incorporated into the real like code that was shipped to users.
Awesome, cool. We're at time. We're gonna take a quick group photo and a wave for our Instagram story. So make sure to follow us at design.buddies. You can stop screen sharing and I can take the photo.
Okay.
And everyone, I'll give you some time to turn on your camera, fix your hair and all that, and I'll count down. And we can take a regular one, a funny one, and also a wave. So just like follow my voice cue on what to do, and I'll post these in Design Buddies on our social media channel later. We have 11 pages, so make sure to bear with me as we do this. And yeah, so and our wave will be on Instagram story. So I'll count down 10 seconds to blast off, which means I'm taking the photo. So turn on your camera, fix your hair, grab your stuffed animals if you want, have them in a photo too. I have a little Shiba here and a little Pusheen if you guys want. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7. I'll stay smiling because there's 11 pages, by the way. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Keep smiling. All right, that was all the pages. You can do a funny photo as well, and then we're gonna do a wave. So bring your stuffed toys or anything else, or just smile or dab or yeah, anything you want. Oh my god, I see some pets. That's so amazing. I have my Octocat. I actually have my Boba. It's my Boba.
Oh, so cute.
I just have a bunch of stuffed animals lying around because I take photos like this a lot for my meetings.
All I have is this artisan keycap.
Oh, nice.
I guess this will work.
All right, funny photo / plushie flex. All right, we'll do one more. This time you can wave, you can dab, you can dance, you can, yeah, anything you want. This is for our Instagram story at design.buddies. And it will be on our story. So I'm opening the app. So keep waving until I say so, until I get through all the pages as well. You can wave, you can dab, wave your stuffed animals. Hello, buddies. Woo, yeah. Awesome.
Yay.
Cool. All right, thank you. If Xinni could stay like just like a few minutes for a quick debrief, that would be great. Everyone else, feel free to join Design Buddies and join us on the conversation there. Enjoy the rest of your night. Hope you all enjoyed the talk, and I'll be posting this story on the Instagram story right now.